no one dared to say no to me. From a very young age, I understood that my presence silenced corridors and commanded reverence in every glance. Not because of who I was, but because of everything my last name represented. I was Brigitte Whitford, daughter of the most feared and influential man on the East Coast, called a king, not just for his ruthless business dealings, but because his control was absolute over people, over situations, and especially over me. I was raised like a rare jewel, displayed with pride, protected with obsession, and polished until my natural shine was lost. Every step I took was calculated, every gesture scrutinized, every word spoken with the caution of someone who knew a single misstep could become a headline. I grew up in the finest schools, the most lavish ballrooms, tailored dresses and dinners, where my smile had to remain flawless for hours, even as my soul screamed inside. There was no room for doubt. The world around me was as rigid as marble. I was to be the link between generations, the perfect cog in the cold machinery of the empire my father had built with iron fists, and for a long time I played my part. I obeyed. I bowed my head. I smiled when told. I stayed silent when I burned. Until the day when, in an act of rebellion I didn't fully understand, I found myself caught in the gaze of a stranger. He was in the wrong place at the wrong time, or perhaps at the exact right moment for everything to begin crumbling. And for the first time in my life, someone looked at me without reverence, without calculation, without fear. It was just a look, simple, direct, human. But in that instant I felt visible, not as a symbol, not as an heiress, just a woman. And the sensation was so unexpected it hurt. It hurt to realize I had spent over 20 years being everything but myself. And it hurt even more to know that a single, honest glance from someone who didn't even know my name was enough to set everything inside me in motion. After that chance encounter, something inside me refused to return to its former state. It was as if an invisible cord had been pulled, stretching every part of my carefully constructed framework until it began to crack. In the days that followed, I tried to convince myself nothing had changed. I continued with the diplomatic dinners, the silent meetings where my presence was required but my voice wasn't, the sessions with stylists and advisors who told me how to appear untouchable, but everything started to feel fake, futile, hollow. I looked around and no longer saw beauty, only the endless performance of a play where I was the protagonist but never the author. And it consumed me from within with a force I couldn't name, because it wasn't anger nor sadness nor rebellion, it was a calling. An impulse I tried to silence, but which grew louder every time I remembered how that man looked at me, with curiosity, with life, with freedom. I learned his name before I admitted to myself that I wanted to know it. Liam. He worked for a landscaping company that serviced our hotel in Boston. Nothing noble, nothing glamorous. But there was something in his simplicity that disarmed me. One day, without planning, I went downstairs before a gala dinner began and saw him outside, his shirt sleeves rolled up, hands dirty with soil, but a light smile as if the world carried no weight. I should have turned away. I should have remembered my expensive dress, the cameras, the society columns, but instead I stayed, and he saw me, and once again the world slowed just to make room for that moment that felt whole. He approached, unhurried, unafraid, and offered me a fallen flower. He didn't say anything grand, just, it was about to be stepped on, thought it deserved a chance. That undid me, not the flower, but the fact that for the first time, someone offered something without expecting anything in return, without trying to impress me, without calculating what they'd gain. Just a gesture, just a look, just a truth. From that day on, I began to search for him with my eyes, even when I told myself I wasn't. And every time I found him, in a hallway, in a quick glance, in a brief exchange of simple words, something in me calmed, and at the same time, something stirred more fiercely. I was still the princess of the Whitford Empire, but in silence, I was becoming something I'd never been allowed to be, a woman with her own desires. And in that silent complicity of glances, I began to understand that my entire life had been written with someone else's pen. For the first time, I wanted to hold it in my own hands. The end came slowly, as everything that matures in silence does. But when it arrived, it left no room for turning back. I could no longer hide the absence of myself at events where I once shone like a polished statue. The dresses felt heavy, the conversations sounded rehearsed, and the smiles I'd practiced for years in front of photographers began to crack at the edges. But it was at home that the fissures became undeniable. My father, always attuned to any shift that might threaten his image of control, noticed. Perhaps not the reason, not at first, but the symptom. He watched me with the eyes of someone who evaluates, measures, judges. A look that had paralyzed me many times before, but which now began to lose its power. Because for the first time, I was tasting the flavor of choice. When he announced the deal with the Hargrove family, a strategic marriage as he called it, I knew that would be my breaking point. I was summoned to the room I always hated, where deals were struck and fates decided as if they were pieces on a chessboard. He spoke of legacy, stability, honor. He said I had a duty, that the family's image depended on my obedience, and I listened, in silence, as I always had. But something inside me was screaming so loudly that my wrists trembled, my breath faltered, and the tight dress I wore seemed to want to suffocate my chest. When he finished, I simply said, "No." One word, but so charged with life it was like a stone thrown against the stained glass of that house. He didn't react with anger at first. He laughed, a dry, disbelieving laugh, as if my gesture were just another foolish performance. But when he realized I wouldn't back down, his eyes hardened. He called me ungrateful, weak, irresponsible. He said I was throwing away everything we'd built. I responded with something I didn't even know I'd been holding. "You built it for me, but never with me." That silenced the room, and perhaps in that moment I ceased to be a daughter in his eyes. But for the first time, I became whole in my own. I returned to my room with trembling hands, my heart racing, and the certainty that something had changed forever. The door was closed, the walls the same. But I was no longer. I had disobeyed the king, and not out of rebellion, not out of pride. I had disobeyed for something no one in that house would ever understand. Love. A love that hadn't even been fully lived yet, but that had already shown me more truth than all my years of obedience combined. And there, alone in front of the mirror, still dressed as the perfect heiress, I whispered to myself, if I'm going to fall, let it be for something I chose to love. The days that followed were a dense mix of silence and resistance. My father didn't speak to me. The calls with the Hargroves were abruptly cut off, but not without the scandal spreading through society's back channels like a smoldering fire, warm on the outside, destructive within. My public appearances were suspended under the pretext of a rest trip, my passwords restricted. The staff's eyes tense. Everything in the house became more rigid, colder. But inside me, there was a new warmth, and it had a name. Liam. I hadn't seen him in weeks. Since the day he offered me that fallen flower, our encounters had grown increasingly rare. After the explosion with my father, I was locked inside the marble palace he called home, and contact with the outside. World was nearly severed, but what no one in that house knew was that true feeling finds cracks, no matter how small. And on a rainy afternoon, hidden under a wool coat and with my eyes lowered, I left the house through the service entrance. I went to the garden at the back of the hotel where we'd met, where it all began. I didn't know if he'd still be there, but my heart knew, and he was. Liam saw me from afar and stopped what he was doing. I wanted to run to him, to say everything I couldn't, but my legs hesitated. It was he who approached, with the calm of someone who respects another's time, even with his own chest at war. When he asked if I was okay, my response was a held-back tear and a short sentence. I said no. His eyes softened. He understood. He didn't ask for more. He didn't demand explanations or assurances. He just took my hand, dirty with soil, firm, real, and led me to a bench covered with wet leaves, where the world seemed to pause. We talked there, like two people who knew loving was dangerous but could no longer avoid it. He told me about his childhood, about the mother who left too soon, about the jobs he'd had, about the freedom he'd learned to love, and I told him about the gold that binds, about the voiceless corridors, about how lonely it is to grow up in a crystal cage. On that bench, under a heavy sky with our fingers intertwined, I realized it was too late to turn back. Not because I'd lost myself, but because at last I'd found myself, and what I found no longer fit within my father's rules. In the days that followed, the little I managed to live with Liam was enough to change everything. It wasn't the idealized romance of books. It was real. It was stolen moments, hidden smiles, quick walks. It was not knowing what tomorrow would bring, but choosing to live anyway. For the first time, fear didn't paralyze me. It was there, of course, but it was no longer enough to stop me. I knew the final confrontation would come soon. My father wouldn't let this go lightly, but I no longer trembled at the thought of facing him, because now I had something he'd never known how to cultivate: courage rooted in love. It didn't take long for the blow to come. My father always had a peculiar way of dealing with disobedience. He didn't shout, didn't make scenes. He simply erased people, stories, bonds, as if they'd never existed. And that's exactly what he tried to do with Liam: erase him from my life's narrative as if he were a printing error. One day I returned from the market to find the hotel's entrance closed for unforeseen renovations. Days later, I learned the landscaping company had lost its contract with all Whitford-related businesses. And finally, I was told Liam had left the city, without warning, without a note, without a goodbye. For a few days, I let myself believe he'd given up on me, that maybe it was easier to flee than face the storm. But deep down, something in me knew. Liam wasn't the kind of man who backs down out of fear. If he left, it wasn't by choice. And it was at that moment that the pain took on a new name: injustice. The anger that grew in silence began to take shape. Because what my father did wasn't just retaliation. It was an attempt to erase the woman I was becoming. He knew. He knew that by tearing Liam away from me, he wasn't just punishing the man. He was trying to break what had grown inside me with more strength than any forged alliance: the freedom to love as I wished. But instead of retreating, I rose. I started searching. I looked for news, contacts, clues. I found a gardener who worked with Liam, and he gave me an address, not with certainty, but with hope. It was a small town a few hours away, where he had distant family. I went there without telling anyone. I left only a letter on my desk, not to justify, but to make it clear I was choosing. I arrived at dusk, the sky a copper hue, And there in the yard of a modest house, I saw Liam, kneeling, planting something with dirty hands and a serene expression. He saw me, and in that instant there was no need for words. The world could have stopped spinning and everything would still make sense. We embraced with the force of those who'd been stolen and returned at the same time. And there, with my eyes closed and my heart pounding against his chest, I knew. Everything I'd faced so far hadn't been in vain. My love wasn't a mistake. It was a choice. And even with all the losses still to come, with all the closed doors, with all the judgments, I would choose again, 1,000 times. Because what was between us wasn't fleeting. It was a seed, and it had already taken root. The return was inevitable, not because I wanted it, but because some cycles only close when you look your enemy in the eye and say, with conviction, that you're no longer afraid. I came back different, less a princess, more a woman, less obedient, more whole. And perhaps that's what scared him when he saw me walk through the door with my head held high, no makeup, no disguises, no usual armor. My father stared at me for long seconds, as if trying to decipher when his daughter had vanished and been replaced by this figure he could no longer control. "You've made your choice. Now face the consequences," he said, cold, direct, and, for the first time, I didn't shrink. I simply replied calmly, "That's exactly what I came to do." I didn't want his money. I didn't want his name. I only wanted to return, with dignity, the expectation he'd projected onto me like a sentence. I left the cards, the keys, the privileges on the table, and he, as always, kept his composure. But his eyes faltered for a fraction of a second. It was quick, but I saw it. I saw the fear, I saw the loss, and I also saw the inability to love someone without trying to possess them. I returned to Liam with empty hands, but for the first time, with a light heart. We rented a small house on the outskirts of the city. Nothing glamorous, nothing grand, but it was ours, and that was enough. The days began to resemble who I wanted to be, simple, true, whole. We spent mornings tending to a small but meaningful garden. In the afternoons, he taught me the names of plants, and I read aloud to him books I'd never been able to read aloud before, because there'd been no one to listen. At night, we cooked together, laughed quietly, and made plans that didn't need to conquer the world. They just needed to fit us. Freedom came at a cost, yes. I was erased from magazines, events, the circles that once revolved around me. Some old friends drifted away. Others, in silence, wrote to me saying they wished they had the same courage. But none of that hurt as much as imagining that he, my father, would grow old without ever knowing who I truly was. And yet, I wouldn't go back. Because loving Liam taught me that obedience isn't respect, that presence isn't submission, and that I could indeed disobey a king and still be the queen of my own story. Life outside the palace was quieter, but also more honest. The days no longer had the theatrical urgency of gala events or the meticulously calculated smiles meant to please. They had a different rhythm now. A coffee brewed slowly, a hug before sunrise, a touch at the end of the day that said, "I'm here." And that, for me, was royalty enough. With Liam, I discovered that love doesn't need to shout to be profound. It can be made of small gestures, holding hands at the market, sharing a blanket on the couch, a note left on the pillow saying the bath water was already warm. I, who was once shaped to shine under spotlights, learned to cherish the light that came from within. The rebuilding wasn't without stumbles. There were days when fear knocked unannounced, when money was tight, when the past insisted on haunting, when someone recognized my face and whispered as if I'd been a scandal and not a choice. But Liam always knew how to bring me back to the ground, to peace, to the center of myself. There was a quiet strength in him that anchored me. He never tried to save me. He just reminded me with his presence that I no longer needed to be what others wanted. It was also during this time that I discovered what it truly meant to have a voice. I started writing, first short texts, then memories, and then a book. No grand signatures, no renowned publisher, just my story, told the way I lived it, with pain, with love, with choice. And when I received the first letter from a young woman saying my words made her rethink the path she'd take, something inside me bloomed fully. The woman who'd been silenced for so many years was now guiding others to find their own freedom. 1 day years later, I received an unexpected call. My father was ill, frail, alone, surrounded only by what he'd built, wealth, power, and emptiness. I hesitated. Part of me still carried scars too deep to risk bleeding again. But another part, perhaps the one Liam loved most in me, wanted to look into the eyes of the man who was once my king and say, finally, who I was. I went to him, without armor, without anger. And when we faced each other, there was no longer the fear of before. There was a tired silence between us. He tried to say something but couldn't, so I spoke. I didn't come for forgiveness. I came because the woman you tried to silence chose to live, and lived well. He only nodded. His eyes welled up. And in that wordless gesture, I knew he understood. Perhaps too late, but he understood. I returned from that visit different, not sad, strangely at peace, as if something that had been pending for too long had finally found rest. I no longer needed his approval or the belated recognition I might have begged for in another phase of life. What was enough now was the truth I lived every day, the freedom to walk barefoot in the yard, to skip makeup if I didn't feel like it, to love without it meaning imprisonment. Liam was waiting for me on the porch when I arrived, with a cup of tea and that serene look that seemed to have the power to mend my most fragile parts. He didn't ask how it went. He just pulled me close, kissed my forehead, and held me in silence. And in that gesture, I found more comfort than in all the crystal ballrooms I'd once frequented. With time, what we built became a kind of shelter, not just for us, but for others too. We began welcoming women in situations like mine, young women pressured by families, older women seeking new beginnings, people who just needed a space to breathe and remember they still had choices. And with every story we heard, I recognized myself a little more, because deep down, we'd all been a version of Brigitte, a princess surrounded by gold and chains, longing for just one chance to choose with her heart. Liam, with his infinite calm, helped me turn pain into purpose. And I, with my relentless drive to start anew, showed him that even the driest soil can bloom again when there are hands willing to care. Our days became filled with simple purpose: tending the land, listening to stories, offering shelter, cooking for those who arrived, writing for those who couldn't come. It was a quiet life, but full. And every night, as we lay side by side, with the windows open and the breeze carrying the day's memories, I thought, this was it. This was what I wanted. Not a throne, not a castle. Just this home, this heart, this man, and this love. So whole, so pure, so profoundly free. Time passed, as it always does, silent and inevitable. Liam's hair grew grayer, and mine no longer, hid the years, and for that very reason, they seemed more beautiful to me. Our garden bloomed each season with a new surprise. It was as if the earth wanted to thank us for choosing to live with simplicity and truth. The house that was once just a refuge became a beacon for many. And with every story shared on the porch, every grateful glance, I understood more clearly that disobeying the king was in fact obeying myself. One morning, Liam brewed coffee earlier than usual. When I sat at the table, he was holding a small wooden box, one of those weathered by time, that holds more than objects. It holds memory. Inside, I found the dried flower he'd given me at our first meeting, still whole, still delicate. And with it, a note in his firm handwriting. "You saved my world the moment you abandoned yours for me." I cried, not out of sadness, but for the beauty of what we'd built, for knowing that despite everything we'd faced, there was still enough tenderness between us for gestures like that. And more than that, there was gratitude. That same year, my father passed away. There was no magical reconciliation, no tearful embraces. Just one last look exchanged weeks earlier in which I think he recognized the woman I'd become far from his name. I attended the funeral out of respect for the history, not obligation. And when I returned home, I took off my shoes, let down my hair, and went to pick tomatoes in the garden. That's how I lived now, with my feet in the earth and my heart light, with the certainty that everything I'd lost could never compare to what I found when I stopped obeying to, at last, love. Liam and I grew old together, not like a fairy tale, but like truth, with back aches, with tea instead of wine, with quieter laughs, but with ever deeper glances. And until our last days, we always knew one thing, that love, when it's free and chosen, is worth any castle you abandon to live it. Years have passed since Brigitte left behind the gilded world, where she was treated as a relic but never as a woman. With Liam, she built something infinitely more valuable than political alliances or corporate legacies, a home with true roots, cultivated in freedom, affection, and choice. She didn't live a fairy tale. She lived a real story, with losses, fears, rebuildings. And for that very reason, she lived fully. The woman who once feared disobedience learned to guide her own story with the strength of someone who's faced what many never dared. Brigitte wasn't saved. She saved herself, and in doing so, she saved love too, a love without crowns, but with truth.